In Trinidad and Tobago, the East Indian outnumbers the African. So God forbid if there was a clash, the East Indians would probably win, not just on numerical strength, but they own the used car industry. They own and run a lot of the petty shops. So not only do I have a numerical minority over the black man, I have an economic influence over the black man. They told me flat out that the East Indians are the ones bringing the drugs and the guns in through the used cars. They said they pack the used car with the dope and the guns, and that's how they bring it into Trinidad. So they already know what's going on. But my point is, Trinidad is just one example. If you keep on letting immigrants come in, invest, buy land, own land, build industry, and you don't empower Jamaicans, Nigerians, or anyone else to push back and challenge them, you've basically sold your island to them already.
Shout out to Dr. Umar, man. I rock with the brother. Powerful brother. Powerful brother. But like I said before, the greatest deception in the Western Hemisphere is that the melanated peoples, the so-called blacks, are not indigenous to the lands. This causes great confusion because a lot of us believe that our African brothers and sisters sold us all out, and that the all-powerful Europeans came through and wiped out everybody, or at least the vast majority of peoples that were here, and were able to transport millions of Africans in a short period of time. Once we fall for this paper genocide, it leaves us open for manipulation. And for me, that's the root cause of a lot of our issues. So we got to jump into the timeline. Like we did in episode 1 with Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Trinidad for me is a beautiful island to really study the timeline. So we could see the discrepancies and start to make sense of what's really going on. So let's jump right in. In 1498, Columbus discovers Trinidad. From 1498 to 1592, there's no colonization. Colonization begins 1592 in what they call St. Joseph, which was the capital before what we have now is Port of Spain. From 1592 to 1784, there's slow growth. Because this is an unimportant island, a small, unimportant island in the Empire of Spain. Spain has a lot going on. There's New Spain. You know, there's stuff going on in Cuba, like we spoke about in episode 1. There's Santo Domingo. There's a lot of stuff going on. So this is a small, unimportant part of the Spanish Empire. So for the most part, is under 200 settlers for a period of time. Until about 1783. This is when the Spanish governor opens up the borders. The cedula of 1783 opens up the borders, inviting French planters and others. The French planters and their slaves. And for population growth, they give them incentives of land grants. Now, the French as well had a lot going on at that time. So they were fleeing from Martinique, Waterloo, Haiti, etc. So now with the French coming in, we have population growth. And let's jump to 1797 because this is when the British took over. And we have census data from that particular period of time so we can understand the population. In 1797, there is recorded about 18,627 people. 2,500 whites, 5,000 free blacks, 10,000 slaves, 1,082 Amerindians. So under 20,000 people in 1797, 3 years before 1800. Your grandmother's grandmother was probably around. If not, your great-grandmother's great-grandmother. Just the other day, 1797. If we jump 9 years to 1806 to 1807, the British, they prohibited the slave trade. So there would be no way for African slaves to be coming in. But remember, under 20,000 in 1797. If we fast forward a little bit, a couple of decades, they put on the Act of Abolition. Then we have emancipation in 1834. We have the apprenticeship period. And let's jump to 1845, because this is when the first East Indians start coming into the island. So once again, there would be no African slaves coming in because the slave trade is already prohibited from 1806. And even if the East Indians are coming in, so it doesn't make any sense for African slaves to be coming in when they already, the slaves in the island are already like, yo, we're not doing this. And they have to resort to bringing in East Indians. And mind you, this is not because the British are kind and you know, they felt bad for slavery. It was just bad business at that time. Too many rebellions, too many revolts, too much resistance. So they had to switch up the plan to the indentured slavery, the indentured servitude. So from 1845, now let's really think about this. From 1845 to 1917, there's about 140,000 East Indians coming in. 140,000 versus the under 20,000 that we had a couple decades before of slaves. Actually, 10,000 slaves, to be specific. 140,000 East Indians coming in between this period of time. Now, on this small island, when we analyze the population now, the population right now is 1.5 million, just about. And the East Indians and the blacks are pretty close in ratio. How, and if we look at it from 140,000 over the years, up to 1917, and then of course, having kids, and increasing of the population, we could understand how they get to where they at now. In what period of time do we have 140,000 black people coming in to the island to match the East Indians, so we could understand how the population it is as it is today? There's no period of time. You know why? Because they were already there. The so-called blacks are the indigenous people of the islands. There was no period of time for them to bring in 140,000. Like we said, 1797, 10,000 slaves, under 20,000 people. 1797, 3 decades later. You already abolished slavery, and then a couple years after that, you start bringing in East Indians. And for the next couple of decades, you bring in 140,000 East Indians. So what period of time do you get 140,000 blacks to match the East Indians? There's no period of time on the timeline for that. That would only mean that the so-called blacks were already there. And we have to understand, just like in the Americas, in the 1790 census, there was 4 million people in the United States. That does not mean that it was 4 million people only in the whole United States. This was just the colonial parts of the United States in the 13 colonies. This is who they accounted for in their colonization. They had wars and raids going on from Indians, so of course there were other people already there in the United States. 4 million people could fit in Brooklyn right now. It's probably just under 4 million people, literally. And this was spread amongst the 13 colonies. This does not mean that they were the only people in the United States of America. The same thing applies to Trinidad. 18,000 people in 1797 does not mean that there were only 18,000 people on the island. There were different tribes that were already there. But of course, they just were not participating in the colonization. Is they're not slaves. Just like us, a lot of us don't want to partake in wage slavery, but we're in a state of duress. We're forced to. We have no other choice, we believe. So we play the game. But these people were more in tune with their culture. They were sovereign. They were already free, so they're not partaking in that. So this is why they would not be counted in the census. As the years go by with the missionaries and they indoctrinating us into their way of life, their capitalism, then the numbers will go up. That is the paper genocide. It's not because they're bringing in people. There's no period of time where they would bring in hundreds of thousands of people, black people. And there's another thing I want to add in. There was a somewhere in history, the Spanish used the term Caribs to describe warlike people. The warlike who are prone to resistance. And it was a blanket term because obviously the Indians had their own, the indigenous had their own identities. So this was a blanket term, sort of like maybe blacks or niggers in the United States. Because it was used to justify the disciplinary actions that they would have to use against these warlike people. Kind of like if you see a police officer abusing a black person, a black man, you might think, unspoken at least, or maybe the Europeans, the blacks, they usually criminals. This is why we're flooding the jails in America. They're criminals. They do bad things. Listen to the rap lyrics. So it's justification. It's a blanket term to justify the disciplinary actions. Who are these people? Black people are clearly the most rebellious. Clearly the Caribs. In this tropical climate. Who would it be? Where do you get the time to do it? And then on top of that, there's so many rebellions going on, so many revolutions. If we look at the 1700s, there's the French and Indian War going on from 1754 to 1763. This is how the French was already in turmoil because there's a lot going on the mainlands and on the islands. In Jamaica, we got the Taki Revolt in 1760. There's the Berbice Revolution in Guyana, where they held the island down for a year, the land down for a year. There's a slave trade going on in Mexico from the Asians, an Asian slave trade that we most of us don't know about. There's revolts, Pueblo Revolt in the 1600s. There's so much going on. Where do you get the time to bring over millions of slaves from Africa? While you're fighting all these wars and people are already here. There's no time for it in the timeline. Why? Because it's a lie. Great deception. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. We got to get deeper. It's so much deeper we go. But we have to look at the timeline to really start to understand the manipulation that's going on, the trickery. And we're definitely gonna go into a part 2, and we're gonna make a lot more sense of it. But I think that's it for now. We're gonna get deeper. Peace, y'all.